Shogun, one of the most critically acclaimed and audience well-received shows of 2024, perhaps even of the whole decade so far. Endless praise has been heaped upon this series, and deservedly so. The 2024 adaptation of Shogun was expertly made and meticulously crafted. Does that mean it was perfect? Absolutely not. But it does seem like if you were a general audience viewer who didn't read the book or know much about the real events leading up to the Battle of Sekigahara, that yes, you probably had a fantastic time with the show. There is certainly a lot to love about it, and although yes, nitpicks can be made about its overall quality, which we will get into later in this video, I do think that most of the major complaints against the series will be levied by people who did read the book, or knew the real history and were disappointed with what this adaptation did or didn't do for the story and characters. Certainly, you saw me making these same complaints throughout all the episodes that I reviewed over the 9 weeks it aired, and it was fascinating to watch all of your reactions shift and change over time as well. I feel like I became the YouTuber who didn't like Shogun, as people would occasionally pop up in my comment sections to go, "Oh, so this is where the minority of people who don't like the show are hiding," or some similarly worded message. But as I keep saying, I did still really have a lot of fun with the show, despite any complaints I have about it. There is so much to adore about this series, and I want to ensure that all credit is given to the aspects that I feel really succeeded. Now, this review is going to perhaps be a little bit different than any other review that you might have watched about the series so far, as I am someone who comes into it with not only knowledge of the novel itself, prior 1980 adaptation, the real history behind the story, and of course the fact that I review other samurai films already, so how I interpret the show is going to obviously be a bit different. But I also imagine many of you who are watching this right now might also have the exact same background I do. It seems like most of my regular viewers have read the book, know the real history, and watch samurai films, so I imagine we share plenty of opinions already. Yet before we dive in, I want to quickly give some background regarding my own journey to this series, if that makes any sense. I had originally watched the 1980 adaptation of this story a number of years ago, and later went on to put out my own review of it. This was my first encounter with James Clavell's classic story about John Blackthorne and his adventure in Japan. I know this TV miniseries from 1980 was already quite beloved, as I had never really seen anyone make any major complaints about it. In fact, it seems like for a lot of people it really kickstarted their interest in Japan. For me, however, there were aspects I was not too fond of. Things like the focus being too much on the love story between Blackthorne and Mariko, and not enough drama and political intrigue regarding the looming war between Toranaga and Ishido. Well, flash forward several years and this new adaptation was on the horizon. And after the first trailer for it, I had put out an initial impressions video giving my thoughts on how it looked. It was here I really started to get flooded with a lot of comments asking for me to read the book before watching the series. Most of these comments were pretty nice encouragement regarding how the book had affected their lives and interest in Japan. Yet there were other comments that were a bit more on the rude side and were insisting that I had no right to review the show at all unless I read the book first. So, after all of this, I did go on to listen to the audiobook version of the novel, which, despite some details here and there, I did very much enjoy, and I could easily see why so many people loved it. Finally, we come to the point where this new series premiered at last. I thought it started out pretty good, but over time, cracks were starting to show. From smaller elements to larger questionable decisions, which greatly altered the story in perhaps detrimental ways. And I think it was by episode 4 or 5 that I began to notice a shift in the comment section of my reviews. Where before there was only praise for the series, now all of a sudden there are people who are becoming increasingly upset with the changes from the book. But while those people were upset, others seemingly began to champion the fact that they had never read the book and were still loving the series. Or perhaps that because they had not read the book that they could better enjoy the series. So now all of a sudden there was this divide between the book readers and non-book readers. I imagine this is how discourse regarding an adaptation of a story usually goes, but it was new for me to experience, watching it all play out in real time in my comment sections. It was also funny to see people telling me that because I was comparing the series so much to the book that it was ruining my enjoyment of the show, when just several months prior I had tons of people asking me to read the book in preparation for the show. All in all though, I am very glad I did read the book because it certainly gave me plenty of insight into the story as it unfolded, despite the times I forgot minor details from the book here and there. If anything, this just goes to show how immense the story of Shogun is, being over 1,000 pages long and over 52 hours if you are listening to the audiobook like I did. But as the series came to a close, we certainly saw all the ways it had deviated from its source material, in both very positive and negative ways. Yes, there was a lot they changed that I think actually improved certain aspects. More focus given to certain characters, new relationships or interactions that built up further tension in meaningful ways. Things like making Ochiba and Mariko childhood best friends, Ishido attempting to marry Ochiba to gain legitimacy, Blackthorn training the Japanese in how to better use artillery instead of firearms, which historically they were already very familiar with. These changes and so many more were really great moves that I was extremely happy to see this show make. Yet that wasn't always the case, and when certain key details were missing, it was extremely noticeable by those of us who had read the book, or at the very least had seen the 1980 adaptation, which I do think is far closer to the book in many aspects. However, that also doesn't mean that the 1980 adaptation is better than this new 2024 adaptation either. It's complicated, they are both different. The story of Shogun is complex for sure, and how both of these two adaptations approached it is vastly different. Now, I imagine most of you watching this video are already well versed on the story itself, but for those of you who are not, here's a brief setup for it. The story of Shogun, or at least the original story of Shogun, is about the arrival of John Blackthorn in Japan in the year 1600. Blackthorn is based off of the real historical figure William Adams. He is an English navigator on board a Dutch trade ship. He arrives in Japan as the country sits on the precipice of a new war, as the ambitious Tokugawa Ieyasu, known in Shogun as Yoshi Toranaga, is attempting to seize power over the entire country for himself. Blackthorn, like the real Adams, comes to directly work with Toranaga as they seek to achieve their greater aims. Yet, as we come to see, the story of Blackthorn takes an unexpected turn when he falls in love with the Lady Mariko, who too comes to play a key role for her lord Toranaga, one which will shape the fate of Japan. It is a story of discovery, war, politics, friendship, and love. But like I said, I imagine many of you already know this. What the 2024 adaptation is, when it is hitting its stride and firing on all cylinders, is an immensely compelling tale with gorgeous cinematography, an absolutely stunning soundtrack, and many career-defining performances, further backed up by meticulous attention to detail for its sets, costumes, language, and many other historical details. And you can see just how deep they went if you watch the interview with the historical advisor Frederick Cranes. Now, there were still some inaccurate things here and there, like the token Hollywood ninja scene, but all in all, from a visual and tonal point of view, the show nailed it. I think the only complaint I had about anything with the way the show looked was the fact that they made it all wet and rainy for what seemed like almost 80% of the time. And I know I wasn't alone on this complaint either, so you can see how this overly bleak atmosphere began to really wear people out the more the show stuck with it. Now, although there were many differences throughout this adaptation to its source material, the one area I think was the largest difference is in regards to where the series tried to place its focus. In prior versions of the story, Blackthorn was definitely the main character, with the other two major characters being of course Mariko and Toranaga. The story largely just centers around these three characters, with of course the myriad of others who come to play interesting roles as well. However, in this adaptation, the focus is instead more split up between a larger number of these characters. Blackthorn is no longer the main character, but one character amongst many. This worked out amazing for characters like Ishido, Ochiba, Yabu, Buntaro, Fujiko, Hiramatsu, and Elvito, who all received this fantastic extra attention to detail to make them brilliantly fleshed out. I absolutely loved each of these characters and felt the actors playing them did tremendous work. But sadly, it came at the cost of other characters losing crucial time they needed for their own stories and development. I think this was most felt with the original main characters of Blackthorn, Mariko, and Toranaga. Even though it is awesome to explore more of the story of significant side characters and antagonists, it should not come at the cost of losing important time with the actual characters who are driving the whole plot along. Because at the end of the day, it's still the actions of Blackthorn, Mariko, and Toranaga that are going to dictate the story, and now because we have less time with them, their characters suffer. Thus the whole story suffers. But at least these characters still got a fair bit of screen time. The same cannot be said for most of the Portuguese and Jesuit characters besides Alvito, who were extremely absent for most of the show. As I said in my episode reviews, this is most felt with Rodriguez, who in the original story sort of becomes Blackthorn's best friend, yet here he is pretty much gone after the early episodes. Now, I get the issue here might be time constraints, of course. They only have 10 episodes to tell this story, or their version of this story, so obviously changes need to be made. But unfortunately, this came at the cost of incredibly significant moments from the book. Things which most book readers I think would agree were significant elements that need to be there for this even to be the same story. I believe the most detrimental omissions all relate to Blackthorn obviously, since he is no longer the main character. We don't see him establish his close friendship with Toranaga, we don't see him really fall in love with Mariko until the very end, and of course we don't get Blackthorn's seppuku attempt until the very end as well. The changing of these details severely shift the story. Now I will say if you are coming in without reading the book, this is obviously probably not an issue to you. And to be honest, I think the story they told in this new series is still very serviceable even with the changes. But then you have to ask yourself, how closely do you want adaptations to follow their source materials? Which of course then comes down to personal preference. In terms of these major changes for the three main characters, I think they are what truly drove my own personal disappointment with the series. Because Blackthorn never had his seppuku attempt, at least not until late in the series, he felt mostly static, not growing or changing, not coming to accept Japan, and not earning the respect of characters like Yabu and Omi, which he did in the book through his original seppuku attempt. Blackthorn's own growth felt stunted. Not that he didn't grow and develop at all, he certainly did, but it never felt as significant as it did in the book. Mariko too became a bit of an issue. Part of this was due to the fact that the romance between her and Blackthorn was not really there, and when it was, it felt forced. Although I will say they still did a tremendous job with her in episode 9, when her and Blackthorn finally submit to their true feelings for each other. This is one of the most beautiful moments in the whole series, which I think could have also been so much more if they would have properly established the relationship between the two beforehand. Now, I know I might sound a bit hypocritical, being that the over-reliance on the romance was one of the things I didn't like about the 1980 adaptation. However, after reading the book, I saw how the original story was able to make the romance a significant element without causing it to completely overtake the story. The romance is necessary. It is integral. But it needs to strike a balance so that it is still felt while not overtaking everything around it. What's unfortunate is that this balance was never found. While the 1980 adaptation relied too heavily on it, the 2024 adaptation nearly got rid of it altogether. This led to most of the romantic scenes, outside of those in episode 9, feeling pretty disjointed, and like I said earlier, forced. Yet, another issue I had with them was also how Mariko was portrayed. Now, I commented on this early on, as her character continued to feel standoffish to Blackthorn, and although she initially had ample reason to be, the continued coldness she showed to him is what made all of their interactions feel awkward and distant. Just nowhere near what most of us book readers are used to with a very warm and caring Mariko. It's not that Anna Sawai did not or could not play Mariko well, as she definitely did have plenty of moments that showed she could, but I feel perhaps it lies more in the writing or direction she was given, where she often comes off as condescending. For me, this turned her away from being a compelling character and into more of an annoyance. I was hopeful when we first saw the new connection the series made between her and Ochiba, and although it did provide some interesting tension in episode 9, I ultimately don't like how this detail played into Toranaga's plan, being that it also relies on Ochiba making bad decisions because of Mariko's actions. But we'll get into all of that soon enough. The sad truth is that I felt nothing when Mariko ultimately met her fate. Granted, I knew it was coming, but it's still a shame to have such an important moment be an emotional dud for me. I surprisingly felt more emotion for a character like Buntaro, and I wasn't alone on this, as I saw plenty of other comments agreeing that they somehow made Buntaro into an extremely compelling character. Now, they were obviously trying to do this, and they succeeded with flying colors, but I still don't know how you turn a character who we are supposed to hate, like Buntaro, into one of the most sympathetic characters in the series. Buntaro is supposed to be a monster, a brutal warrior who is equally as brutal to his wife. Yet here in the series, although we get a glimpse of that side of him, they ultimately manage to turn him into a very sympathetic character. And it just goes to show how the focus of these characters felt so off, where side characters like Buntaro were really allowed to shine, while more main characters like Mariko were not. Once again, this is where the difference will come in if you have read the book or not. If you have not read the book, it looks like the general opinion that I've seen is that Mariko was great. And trust me, I do see where people would think that. However, those of us who already came in with a pre-understood idea of who Mariko is from prior versions of the story felt very shocked by this new interpretation of the character. Because when all is said and done, Mariko, who I've seen others describe as really the heart of the story, was I think one of the show's main failures. But even then, I don't think Mariko is the biggest failure of the series. I sadly think that rests with Toranaga. Between book readers and non-book readers, I don't know how anyone can like this version of Toranaga. Toranaga is such a massive letdown, and I don't know who to put the blame on for this. Was it the writing? Was it the direction? Was it the acting? Or was it a combination of all the above? First off, I don't want to blame Hiroyuki Sanada, yet being that he was a producer on the series, it's hard not to. Hiroyuki Sanada is a fantastic actor who has played some absolutely great characters over the years. I always love seeing him on screen. Yet here, I couldn't help but be very disappointed. This Toranaga felt completely one note, barely ever showing any hint of any other emotion besides his usual quiet seriousness. And because of this, he felt like only a two-dimensional character, a cardboard cutout. So much of his great personality in the story of Shogun is tied to his interactions with Blackthorn, who in the book he has many bonding moments with, as the two genuinely become great friends. In fact, Toranaga in the book even states flat out that the only reason he saved Blackthorn's life at the end was because Blackthorn was his only real friend. They do try to do something similar here where Toranaga says he saved Blackthorn because Blackthorn makes him laugh, but once again that falls completely flat. We only had one real bonding moment between the two, and the rest was all just cold interactions mediated by Mariko. And I believe that it was firmly because of the fact that we didn't see these two characters become friends that both of their stories were lacking by the end, as the way we perceived Toranaga in this adaptation was just joyless. Compare Sanada's performance as Toranaga to that of the legendary Toshiro Mifune in the 1980 adaptation, and you will find a very stark contrast. Where Mifune played Toranaga with a real passion and energy you'd expect from the real Tokugawa Ieyasu, Sanada is always just brooding, more often than not in the rain or in a dimly lit room. He seems like he had zero personality, which is really quite interesting if we compare him also to Ishido, who I think was brilliantly portrayed by Takahiro Hira. He is just another character I absolutely loved every scene we had with. Ishido, for me at least, quickly became one of my favorite characters, once again in large thanks to the increased time we spent with him. So while Toranaga sadly felt just two-dimensional and difficult to root for, Ishido somehow became three-dimensional and very likable. But besides Toranaga's personality being such a letdown, what I think is even worse was how he was portrayed as a leader. Now, in almost every other portrayal we have seen of Tokugawa Ieyasu or Yoshi Toranaga in both books, films, TV, and even games, he is always portrayed as a masterful schemer. He obviously has his own grand vision he is trying to accomplish, and he knows just what he needs to do to achieve it. What's more is that in all of these other versions, we see him at work. We know what he's doing, and for the most part, those around him know what he is doing as well. There is not this secret plan to keep everyone in the dark, along with his closest allies, even at the cost of his greatest commanders. Sure, he does try to lead plenty of people on, but when the appropriate time does come, he reveals his plans to the most important individuals who need to know. And as I've said before, this Toranaga is a far cry from the Toranaga of the book or the real historical figure of Tokugawa Ieyasu, and I think this can be most felt with his plan. Now, I will be clear, both of his plans in the book and in this adaptation hinge on Mariko's final trip to Osaka, but the desired outcome of both of these is what is different. In the book, Toranaga is trying to win over the Christian daimyo to his side, and it is through Mariko's death and the destruction of Blackthorn's ship that he is able to achieve this, as the Christian daimyo are set to betray Ishido, allowing Toranaga to win the great battle of Sekigahara. This is a well thought out plot, one which plays more into the real desires of other leaders, one which is much more calculated. Yet here in this new version, everything instead hinges on Ochiba. As we know from this new adaptation, they changed the backstory for Ochiba to make it so that she and Mariko grew up together as best friends, which makes things all the more interesting, being that it was Mariko's father who had betrayed and murdered Ochiba's father. As I said before, I really loved this change and was hopeful for the great drama it would cause between the two, and I do think they did a great job with this for the most part in episode 9. But what I didn't know at the time was that Ochiba was the main target of Toranaga's plan all along. as through Mariko's death, Toranaga was banking on Ochiba having a change of heart, one which would cause her to switch sides to support Toranaga and deprive Ishido of having the heir's army on his side at Sekigahara, thus also robbing him of legitimacy and causing the other lords to turn on him. Everything about Toranaga's plan centers on Ochiba's turn, which is the dumbest thing to ever bank on. There is no way in a million years that Ochiba should ever consider siding with Toranaga as the right course of action. The main goal for Ochiba is to ensure her son, the heir, comes to power one day. Through her child, she will have her ultimate revenge for the death of her father and the life she had to suffer to get there. But Toranaga and Ishido continue to use the guise that they are just doing what they are doing in the heir's best interest. They both say that they are essentially championing the heir. Ishido is even going so far as to marry Ochiba. And while yes, this is largely just a power move for himself, doing so would also make him the heir's new father, or legitimate guardian figure. But somehow, against all better judgment, Ochiba, after the death of her childhood friend Mariko, decides to throw everything away and support the guy who most of Japan already knows is just trying to take power for himself. This isn't a big secret. Everyone, especially in Osaka, know what Toranaga is trying to do. Despite whatever Toranaga says about his intention to protect the heir, there is already a mountain of tangible proof which shows that Toranaga has ulterior motives, accusations which are levied against him in the very first episode. Ochiba switching sides to support Toranaga is one of the stupidest decisions ever because she is knowingly throwing everything away and dooming the life of her son, as Toranaga is most certainly going to kill him one day. Yes, for those of you who didn't know, this is what happens in real history. The real Tokugawa Ieyasu waited about 14 years and then went after the heir and killed him. You have to ask yourself, what should be more important to Ochiba? The fact that her childhood best friend died because of the man she is engaged to? Or the life and well-being of her son who is destined to one day rule the entire country? Sure, she absolutely has a right to be furious with Ishido, but at the end of the day, Ishido is still her best bet to ensure her son's safety, and that he will one day come to power. And yes, you can argue that Ishido may attempt to steal power over for himself as well, but being that by marrying Ochiba the heir will essentially become his child, the heir is likely still going to remain the heir and one day rule the country. To not side with Ishido to stop Toranaga makes Ochiba seem like her brain just stopped working. This is precisely why it's so incredibly stupid for Toranaga to bank everything in his plan on Ochiba betraying Ishido. Now in the book, Ochiba's reaction is a bit different. In the end, it's alluded to that although she absolutely hated Toranaga for multiple reasons, she decided to keep the heir and his armies from the battle at Sekigahara, not because she is betraying Ishido, but because she fears for her son's safety. She fears that if she sends her son and his armies to Sekigahara, that should Ieyasu miraculously win, he would be honor-bound to kill the heir right then and there. So you can see in the book, Ochiba's decision is more out of fear, not treachery. And even then, the plan still hinges more on the treachery of the Christian daimyo, like I said. So, all of these things, Toranaga's demeanor, his leadership, and his actual plan, all come together to make him, in my opinion, the real biggest failure of this series. And we haven't even talked about Sekigahara yet. Sekigahara seems to be the one area of the series that is getting the most debate online, which is completely expected. Most regular viewers who had not read the book were expecting to see this massive epic battle, the main climax that everything was building to. But as us book readers know, no, we were not going to get the battle. I had initially very high hopes that we might, but by episode 8 I realized it was just not going to happen. People seem to be pretty upset about this, with viewers voicing their frustration of this as a massive buzzkill, stunting what they thought was going to be the grand conclusion. I know this feeling all too well because that's what I wished for the 1980 adaptation, where the battle is also pretty much not there. Yet on the other side of this, we also have this group rising up to almost shame people for even wanting the battle. I'm not saying that every person is doing this, but I have seen some pretty extensive comments going into why we didn't need the battle and why to want one is wrong because the story is about the deeper character drama and not spectacle. And I have to say, like I did in my episode 10 review, that I do understand this argument for both the book and now even the 1980 adaptation, being that both of those versions of the story focused way more heavily on Blackthorn as the main character. I can complain all day about the battle not being featured in either of those two versions, but even then, yeah, I do see what people mean when they say it's not really needed for the story. The Battle of Sekigahara never directly involved the path of John Blackthorne, and in truth, the death of Mariko and even the destruction of his ship is really the climax of his journey. We don't need to see the Battle of Sekigahara in a story mostly centered around Blackthorne, no matter how cool it would be. However, as we've already discussed, this adaptation of the story is much different, giving more time to fleshing out many of the supporting characters, giving them all truly great opportunities to shine, and even causing you to actually like them way more than in prior versions. This was purposeful, but it is also where the problem arises, because while Blackthorne's story doesn't need to include the Battle of Sekigahara, most of their stories should, because their lives depend on it. Saying that the story is not about the battle but about the deeper character drama is silly when many of the characters' stories are directly intertwined with the battle. Thinking like this is like saying we should not have battles in Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or so many other stories that have great character drama but also significant battles, which the story is centered around. I think from even a storytelling standpoint, you have to ask yourself, what is more interesting to experience? Toranaga telling us how things will turn out? Or us actually witnessing the twists and turns of the battle in real time? I think the answer is clear. Now, realistically, do I think they could have even fit the Battle of Sekigahara into this series? No, absolutely not. Not in the 10 episodes they had while trying to tell the story in the way they did. In order to have enough time devoted to the battle, further cuts need to be made to elements prior to episode 9, because I think you absolutely need to have everything they did in episode 9 and 10. If anything, this show just needed to have more episodes. Perhaps a solid 12 like Andor brilliantly used to tell its story. This leads to a lot of people asking for a season 2, or saying there must be a season 2 because of the way it ended. But unfortunately, no, there will be no season 2. This has been confirmed. The story ends right where the book does. What we got is what we got. Ultimately, this was the version of the story that the showrunners were trying to tell. And like I said at the start, you have to give the show credit where credit is due. Yet I also think its failures stem from creative decisions, which while trying to improve certain aspects, ended up severely hurting other aspects. And really, a lack of time to hammer things all home in the most meaningful way. Beneath everything, there is a good story in here somewhere, and I wonder how much might have been cut if anything was cut at all. The same is true for if this could even be edited down further and turned into more of a concise and focused film. Who knows if that's even possible, but it should be interesting to see. There is honestly so much we could talk about that it's hard to try and summarize all my feelings here. I could take a whole video just to talk about the characters, or the battle, or so many other aspects. There were so many portions of this script that I had to edit down just because they turned into just rambling on. What I do want you to know though is that despite the fact that I don't think the show managed to stick the landing, at least for me, it is still a great series, and I think deserves all the awards which it will likely get. However, I will say that if you want a closer representation of the book, the 1980 adaptation sticks way more to the original story. And because of this, just like my review for the original 1980 adaptation, I'm not going to give this series an actual rating, but instead just strongly recommend checking it out. I mean, check out both versions if you somehow haven't already, because they are both worth it in their own ways. Neither are perfect, but both are very interesting. And oddly enough, culturally significant to those of us who are fans of Japanese history, as these two adaptations of Shogun, coupled with the book, have been unique moments that have led to influxes of new people who have become interested in Japanese history because of them. I've seen much of this firsthand, as there have been all sorts of new viewers on my own content, as well as tons of other articles and videos popping up. However, one negative aspect of this is that there seems to be an abundance of new AI-generated history YouTube channels arising as well. Most of them trying to cash in on the popularity of Shogun by covering samurai history. I can't begin to tell you how many crappy new AI channels I've seen recommended to me, with all of their videos using bad AI-generated art, AI voiceovers, and likely AI-generated scripts. Shogun has unfortunately caused an influx of these awful channels springing up, so I just want to give a fair heads up to you all, to make sure that the content you watch is from actual creators who put real time and effort into making their videos. I'm not saying there is not a place for AI-generated content on YouTube. There certainly is, but I don't think it rests anywhere in the realm of history or other educational content. Yet I'm getting way off track. As for this 2024 adaptation of Shogun, it is certainly one of the best pieces of samurai content we have gotten in recent years. with its incredible cinematography, music, acting, and tremendous attention to historical detail. Shogun was, at the end of the day, despite any other complaints I have, a genuine pleasure to experience. And like many people have been saying, you might actually very much like it more if perhaps you are coming in not having read the book, so that is something to consider. It will be interesting to see how this series ages over time, and if perhaps we will get another adaptation of it in 40 years from now. But I want to ask one last time, what did you ultimately think of this 2024 adaptation? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Do you agree or disagree with anything I said in this review? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting.